My segment is on increasing explosiveness and training to maximize jump height in particular, but probably most sort of explosive movements in general. Um, the one weird trick that I'm going to talk about is training with accommodating resistance, or for people who haven't spent much time with the West Side barbell parlance, just training with bands or chains. So just for some very, very basic background for people who have not trained with bands or chains before, aren't very familiar with accommodating resistance. Basically, it's just a different way to add resistance to a variety of exercises, but primarily what I'm thinking about here is barbell exercises beyond just putting more plates on the bar. And so when you add plates on the bar, the barbell is 45 pounds, you slap some 45s on, now it's 135 pounds. And that's just due to gravity, which is pulling straight down all the time. And whatever lift you do, at all points in the range of motion, there will be 135 pounds of resistance you have to overcome. That's just what the weight is. With accommodating resistance, if you hang some like thick elastic rubber bands over the bar, those bands behave as a Hooke's Law spring would, or in other words, as they're stretched, the resistance they provide increases linearly. So at the bottom of a squat, for example, the bands might provide 40 pounds of resistance, and at the top they may provide 80 pounds of resistance, and right in the middle, guess what? They'd provide 60 pounds of resistance. So it allows for variable resistance throughout the range of motion, and chains behave similarly. You can hang chains from the bar, generally off of a smaller chain, so that when you're at the bottom of a lift, most of the chains are on the ground, and then at the top of the lift, most of the chains are off of the ground. So, for example, if you put 100 pounds of chains on the bar at, say, the bottom of a bench press, maybe you're feeling 250 pounds with all of the chains on the ground, and then when you lock it out, you're now feeling 350 pounds because those 100 pounds of chains have come off of the ground. With accommodating resistance, you can vary the amount of resistance you're dealing with throughout the range of motion. And in particular, it makes the lifts a little bit easier at the bottom, a little bit harder at the top. Eric, have you ever done much or any training with bands or chains?
Oh, hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
I mean,
what's your go-to or what's your favorite lift?
It didn't really matter, dude. So when I first got into coaching, working as a strength coach, I was working with a wrestling team and a football team, and I had all the gym access I could ever want. And it was a really well-equipped gym. I would go in there, I was, 18, 19, 20 years old, and just put chains on literally everything because it was so badass.
Oh, I mean, absolutely.
Dips, pull-ups, just throwing, could have easily used any other mode of resistance, but I was like, no, dude, put the chain around my neck.
Yeah.
I would do, rack chins or kind of inverted body weight rows with some chains. I would do bench press with chains. I would just, any excuse to get them in the mix, I would use it.
Yeah, that's completely valid. So I also love chains. I personally don't like bands all that much. Not because I think they're ineffective. I just don't like how they make lifts feel. But
they're, to me, they were always a pain in the ass to set up.
I agree. It's hard to find two bands that have the exact same amount of resistance, so the bar feels a little bit uneven. But anyway, yeah, love chains. Anything with chains, they're loud, and I like things that are loud. You're lifting, you're working out, makes you sound like Jacob Marley, which is very cool. One of the best characters in all of fiction and literature. I really enjoy the way they make most strength curves feel. So that's what we're going to be talking about here for the purpose, not so much of trying to maximize strength gains, but trying to maximize gains in explosive performance. And like I said, specifically jump height. So I actually got in trouble a couple months ago when talking about accommodating resistance. I was on Dave Tate's Table Talk podcast, and this topic came up. And I mentioned that, hey, the research tends to suggest that for specifically maximizing gains in raw strength, like say trying to maximize gains in barbell squat 1 rep max or barbell bench press 1 rep max. Training with accommodating resistance does seem to be effective for strength gains, but doesn't seem to be more effective than just training with straight weight, which in most sectors of the powerlifting community is a pretty uncontroversial opinion. But there are a lot of like big time old school West Side fans in the Table Talk audience. They didn't particularly like that perspective, which is totally fair. But I will note that the research and also just like the training practices of the current best raw powerlifters on the planet agree with me. So on the powerlifters side, I mean, there are a ton of extremely strong raw powerlifters out there. And if you stalk them on social media to see how they train, you just don't see that many folks training with bands or chains a ton anymore. Again, specifically for raw powerlifting, accommodating resistance for specifically strength development does make a lot of sense for equipped lifting because it allows you to experience a strength curve or like a resistance curve that is a little more similar to what you'd be dealing with equipped powerlifting, because like a bench shirt, squat suit helps you more at the bottom of a lift than the top of a lift. So if you don't want to have to deal with getting into all of your gear, but you still want a similar training experience, you can set up accommodating resistance to kind of mimic that. But for raw lifting, yeah, I mean, you just don't see that many top raw lifters doing a ton of training with bands or chains these days. And on the research side of things, in 2015, there was a meta-analysis published by Soria Gila and colleagues suggesting that training with accommodating resistance did in fact improve strength gains to a larger extent than training with straight weight. But then in 2018, another group of researchers led by Dos Santos, I think these folks were just planning on doing a study, like looking at the effects of bands or chains on strength development. So they're like, okay, let's kind of get our feet wet in this research. Let's pull up this meta-analysis, see what it found. And then they started looking through the meta-analysis and said, I think they may have accidentally miscalculated some of these effect sizes. So they wrote in and said, hey, I think there were some errors here. And to the credit of Soria Gila and colleagues, they looked back and said, yep, you got us. Like we made a mistake. So that has now been updated. And the pooled effect is like, yeah, straight weight is effective. Bands and chains are effective. Training with accommodating resistance doesn't seem to be more effective than just training with straight weight, though it does still work.
Do you think that might be the only exercise science meta with an error?
Don't want to get too far off topic, but we should probably talk about that paper.
We will at some point, but for people that are listening, we won't get into it, but there was a paper, I think last week or the week before, that was published indicating they're like, yeah, we went through a bunch of metas in like exercise and sports science. I think they said 85% had a statistical error.
At least one.
Yeah.
Which is both not... That was very unsurprising to us.
Yeah.
But I think it would be surprising to a lot of people. But yeah, it's certainly not what you'd like to see.
Right, yeah. But anyway, sorry to interrupt with that tangent.
But yeah, so training with accommodating resistance in terms of 1 rep max raw strength development doesn't seem to be all that beneficial. Again, it's good. It works fine. It just doesn't seem to work better than training with straight weight. And there's good reason to kind of suspect that it wouldn't be better than straight weight. And the reason for that is just for most exercises, if you're doing a 1 rep max, specifically barbell lifts, generally your strength, your 1 rep max isn't going to be limited by how strong you are through the entire range of motion. It's limited by how strong you are through the very weakest point in the range of motion, which is usually pretty early on in the concentric phase or near the bottom of most lifts. And in fact, it's even earlier on than I think a lot of people realize. Most people assume the weakest point in, say, a squat or a bench press is when the bar is moving the slowest, but it's actually not. It's when the bar is decelerating, because force is mass times acceleration. And so if acceleration is negative, that means there's less force output. So if the bar is still like moving at the same relatively slow velocity, that means the force you're exerting is either equal to or greater than the load on the barbell. If the bar is actively decelerating, that means at that moment in time, you're exerting less force than the force being exerted by the barbell. So yeah, like the weakest point in the lift is even before like what is commonly defined as the sticking point. So it's low down there. That's where you're weakest in most lifts. And so that's what's determining performance. And the way that bands and chains work, it's like I mentioned before, a band stretches as you go up, more chains come off the ground as you go up. So it makes the lift harder near the top of the lift, which is totally fine, but like generally that's not the part of the range of motion that's going to dictate what your 1 rep max is. It's more about, can you create enough force there at the bottom of the lift where you're the weakest? And so like, yeah, I mean, there's every reason to think that training with bands and chains are probably better for building strength through the top part of the lift than training with straight weight would be. But that's not going to influence 1 rep max strength all that much. And training with both straight weight and accommodating resistance should be equally efficacious for increasing strength at the bottom of the lift, like as long as you get the loading right. So those results I think are pretty intuitive. So yeah, that's not all that surprising. But with explosive performance, the calculus is a little bit different. And this is where we're getting into like the actual thrust of this segment. So with explosive performance, it's a completely different ball game, because it's not about how strong you are through the very weakest point in the lift. For something like jumping, it's about how much force can you put through the ground for the entire duration of the time your feet are on the ground. And so if you're getting a lot of velocity going, your feet aren't going to be on the ground very long. You drop down, boop, pop right back up pretty quick. And so for that short period of time, for the entire duration of the time your feet are on the ground, you need to be putting as much force through the floor as possible to accelerate your center of mass. And as soon as your feet leave the ground, the velocity your center of mass has at that point of takeoff will directly determine how high you're going to jump. Because you are no longer putting more force into the floor, therefore an upward force on yourself. As soon as your feet leave the ground, gravity takes over, and your takeoff velocity just like 1-to-1 determines how high you're going to jump. And so you need to accelerate as much as possible during that entire time span you have available to you. And therefore, strength and power output through that entire range of motion is now very, very important. Like if you can exert a lot of force in deep knee and hip flexion, that's cool. But if you can also exert a lot of force with very little knee and hip flexion right before takeoff, that is equally beneficial. So essentially, if there are two people who weigh the exact same amount, they have like similar fiber types, like you equate everything between these two individuals, and they squat the same amount through a full range of motion, but one of them squats way more for like a half squat or quarter squat than the other one does, you should expect that individual with the higher half squat and quarter squat and same full squat to jump higher than the other person, because they have similar force output through that weak part of the range of motion, but through the stronger part of the range of motion, that second individual is stronger, can exert more force, etc. And so, as I mentioned before, a benefit of training with accommodating resistance is you can better match the resistance curve of an exercise with your natural strength curve. So, for example, if you can bench press 225 pounds or like 100 kilos, that basically means that you can exert about, I'm going to use kilos as a force measurement. I realize they're not, but you get the point. That means you can exert about 100 kilos of force where you're the weakest, but at the top, maybe you can exert 120 kilos of force. If you're just training with a barbell, you're stuck with 100 kilos. You can't go heavier than that. You'd fail the lift. With bands or chains, on the other hand, you could potentially set it up to where, maybe you have 90 kilos on the bar and 20 kilos in bands and chains or something like that. It's 90 kilos at the bottom. It's a little bit easier, but then it's 110 kilos at the top. So it's matching that. It's matching the resistance curve of the lift to your natural strength curve a little bit better. So even though that's not going to be extra beneficial for improving your 1 rep max, that probably will be extra beneficial for increasing strength throughout that entire range of motion. And if you're watching on YouTube, there's a figure that we can flash up on the screen now that kind of illustrates how this works, how with accommodating resistance, you can make sure that the lifts you're doing are challenging through a larger relative proportion of the entire range of motion you're training through. And so for that purpose, just kind of on an a priori basis, you should expect that training with accommodating resistance should be better for improving explosive performance. And in fact, that is what we see when we look at the literature. And I'll also note, it's a little surprising how little research there is on this topic. Just because a lot of times practical application guides research to some extent. Like there's a bit of a give and take, like research guides practical application and practical application guides research. If there are a lot of coaches doing something specific in the gym with their athletes, some of those athletes are going to become master students in exercise science and realize like, hey, the stuff that my coaches were doing, I don't think there's research on that. I'm going to do that as a master's project. So there's kind of that feedback loop. And bands and chains are just, from a quote unquote in the trenches perspective, are used pretty frequently for training athletes at all levels of sport. From you're not going to see them in many high school weight rooms, but like training facilities that specialize in training high school athletes, like off the clock or out of school, will often use bands and chains. Plenty of college weight rooms use bands and chains for a lot of stuff, like you mentioned before. So yeah, this is a pretty common thing in practice, but I was only able to find 4 particular studies that have examined this. So comparing training with straight weight versus training with bands or chains, and all of these studies use bands on gains in explosive performance and particularly jump height here. So to start with, a study by Shi and colleagues, SHI, and as a note, mention this every time, all of the studies I cite will be linked in the show notes. So starting with a study by Shi and colleagues, the subjects in this study were collegiate basketball players who were pretty well trained to start with as far as collegiate basketball players go. Average 1 rep max squat was like 125 kilos, which for tall fuckers, like that's not bad. And they completed an 8-week training program. One group just trained with straight weights. The other group trained with a combination of straight weights and bands. And the resistance provided by the bands in the band group was equal to 35% of 1RM at the top of the lift and very, very little at the bottom of the lift. So the amount of load on the bar that was replaced was equal to about 17% of 1RM to equalize average loading between the two groups. So just to illustrate, if a subject had a 200 kilo squat, and I'm just using that to make the numbers easy. So let's say a subject had a 200 kilo squat, and in a particular workout, they're going to be training with 80% of 1RM. So that's 160 kilos. So in the group that was just training with straight weight, you would just do reps with 160 kilos. In the band group in this particular study, what they would first do is remove, they would add an amount of bands that was equal to 35% of 1RM, which in this case would be 70 kilos, so 200 times 0.35, about 70. And then they would replace a portion of that. So in effect, like you would want it to be an average of 160 kilos throughout the entire portion of the lift. So it would be I think they would put 125. Yeah. So it would be 125 kilos on the bar plus the 70 kilos of bands. So it'd be like 125 at the bottom, 195 at the top, average out to 160. So that, like, I did a poor job explaining that, but that's what they did. Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, they train like that for 8 weeks, and ultimately squatting with bands and squatting with straight weight, as one would expect from the rest of the literature, led to similar increases in 1RM squat strength, which again is what we should expect. But squatting with the bands did lead to larger increases in squat jump improvement and counter movement jump improvement. So it was like 21.4% versus 12.9% for squat jump, and 12.9 versus 5.6 for counter movement jump.
Ooh, but the p-value was 0.056, so that doesn't really, I mean, it's not below 0.05, makes you think.
Well, okay, let's just go with squat jump then, which was a p of 0.008.
I'm being a smartass.
I mean,
obviously, I don't subscribe to that nitpicking with regards to p-values.
Yeah.
12.9% is bigger than 5.6%.
I agree with that assessment. Okay, so that was the first study. There were 2 more that had broadly similar results. So one was by Katushabe and Kramer, and the other was by Joy and colleagues. In the study by Katushabe and Kramer, the subjects were male soccer players. They trained for 6 weeks. Again, one group with bands, one group with straight weights. They found that squatting with bands led to at least nominally larger increases in jump height than training with straight weight, so about 2.67 centimeters versus about 1.38. And then in the study by Joy and colleagues, the subjects were, again, collegiate basketball players completing a 5-week training program. One group squatting with a combination of bands and straight weights, the other group just squatting with straight weight. And they looked at 2 measures of vertical jump performance. They measured vertical jump height on both a force plate, so like using an equation to estimate like how high people jumped from their ground reaction forces during the actual jumping movement, and then also just a more direct assessment of jump height using a vertec. And if memory serves, in the study, the vertec jump height improvement, there was a nominal difference between groups. So it was like a 6.3% increase in the band group versus like a 4.1% increase in the straight weight group. I don't think that was a statistically significant difference. And then for the force plate assessment, it was like plus 7.5% in the band group and like minus 1.8% in the straight weight group. And if memory serves, that was a statistically significant difference. But like I said, all of the nominal differences lean in favor of squatting with bands in all of these studies. However, the 4th study by Andersen and colleagues in this little body of literature did come to different results. So the subjects in that study were trained women. They completed 10 weeks of training. Again, one group squatting with bands, or a combination of bands and straight weights, and the other group just squatting with straight weight. And they assessed counter movement jump height with like basically different knee angles to start with. So like how far you would descend for the counter movement before jumping back up. So they looked at kind of like a 2 kind of normal ranges of motion for jumps, so through 60 and 90 degrees of knee flexion. That's around how much most people would flex their knees before a jump. And then they also looked at, like, what if you just did a really, really deep counter movement before you jumped, so down to about 120 degrees of knee flexion. And what they found is that, at least in terms of nominal differences, gains in jump height at 60 degrees of knee flexion were pretty similar between the 2 training approaches. Leaned slightly in favor of squatting with bands, but then at 90 degrees and 120 degrees, those nominal differences leaned in favor of squatting with straight weight. So essentially, we have 3 studies that tend to find benefits in favor of training with accommodating resistance, and we have 1 study that found at least at deeper levels of knee flexion, some benefits maybe of squatting with straight weight. So what could potentially explain the different results between these three studies? And I think the biggest difference is just how much of the total resistance came from bands. So in the three studies that tended to find benefits of squatting with bands, the ones by Shi, Joy, and Katushabe and Kramer, the bands replaced about 15 to 20% of the total load on the bar, with the total band resistance equaling about 30 to 40% of 1 RM at the top. And for the Andersen study, the total band tension used, and therefore the amount of actual weight replaced by bands, was like twice that large. So it was a relatively enormous amount of band tension used in that study. So like that kind of makes sense intuitively, right? So in the Andersen study, they found that through deeper levels of knee flexion, squatting with a ton of band tension maybe wasn't great for improving jump height. But if you have a ton of band tension on the bar, effectively you're just making the very bottom of the lift very easy. So what you should be going for, and I think what 3 of the 4 studies in this area accomplished, is with accommodating resistance, instead of a kind of traditional strength curve or resistance curve you'd see with straight weight, where the bottom of the lift is hard and the top is easy, what you want to do with the amount of accommodating resistance you use is you basically want the entire lift to be similarly challenging throughout. You want the bottom to be challenging, you want the top to be challenging, train that entire range of motion. I think what happened in the Andersen study is they used so much band tension, they inverted that typical resistance curve, where instead of now being hard at the bottom and easy at the top, I think they just made it very easy at the bottom and hard at the top. So there was less transference to jump height at deeper degrees of knee flexion. Overall, this body of literature, and also just kind of the logical reasoning I laid out at the start of this segment, all suggest that training with bands should and does improve jump height and explosive performance, likely to a greater extent than just training with straight weight would, which makes sense. You match the strength and resistance curves better. You build more strength through a longer total percentage of the range of motion you're training through, and that should help you exert force through the floor through a larger total range of motion before your feet leave the ground. So you're not just strong at the bottom, you're strong through that entire range of motion, and that should be beneficial for explosive performance. Like I said, all of this stuff uses bands rather than chains, and it's all mostly just looking at jump performance. So I assume that these are probably generalizable findings. Like, I assume that if you subbed out bands for chains, it would still be beneficial because you're still matching strength curves in the same way. Like what they accomplished with bands in these studies, you can also accomplish with chains. I don't see a reason why benching with bands or doing deadlifts with bands or chains wouldn't have similar effects through those ranges of motion and general movement patterns. Like, if you're trying to build explosive hip hinging strength, like deadlifting with accommodating resistance should be pretty good. We just don't have research on it. But yeah, so I assume these findings generalize. I just don't know for sure. Another note is that the gains in explosiveness in these studies were pretty specific. So I made specific note of talking about the gains in vertical jump performance, and the various sorts of jump tests you do mimic the mechanics of squatting pretty well. But several of these studies also looked at gains in sprint performance or gains in agility test performance. And for those measures, training with bands didn't seem to be more beneficial than training with straight weight. Once again, like with 1 rep max strength, it wasn't that it was less beneficial than training with straight weight. It still worked. There just wasn't like an additive additional benefit. So, like it seems like maybe training with bands will help you jump higher, but might not actually like improve sprint performance or change of direction performance to a greater extent than training with straight weight, which, again, to be very clear, means it's still good. It's just not better. And then finally, for loading recommendations, I think that the 3 studies where training with bands worked are probably a pretty good starting point. So in all 3 of those studies, the amount of band tension used was equal to about 30 to 40% of 1RM, replacing an amount of straight weight resistance equal to about 15 to 20% of 1RM. So that seems to be a pretty good starting point. So for example, like if your 1 rep max squat is 100 kilos, and a workout would typically involve squatting with 80 kilos for sets of 5, you could instead do 60 kilos with 40 kilos of band tension, or 65 kilos with 30 kilos of band tension. So the average resistance throughout the range of motion would average out to the 80 kilos you'd be otherwise training with. But that should help match the resistance curve of the exercise with your strength curve a little bit better by, again, subbing out about 30 to 40% 1 rep max amount of resistance with bands or chains. And then also, just as kind of a final parting note, is intent matters. Intent matters a lot with any power training, whether you're using accommodating resistance or just training with straight weight. You want to really be trying to aggressively accelerate the bar as much as possible through as much of the range of motion as possible, which I'll also note is just another benefit of training with accommodating resistance. Like if you're doing explosive bench press with just the bar, at lockout, the bar has to come to a stop. Like if you have any reasonable amount of load on the bar, you don't want the bar to leave your hands. That's dangerous. Like that's bad. And so a decent percentage at the end of the concentric is going to be spent just decelerating the bar. Like you're not actively trying to push through lockout. Because if you did, the bar would either leave your hands or there would just be like so much inertia in the bar, it would like pull your back up off of the bench. That's happened to me, fucks up the rest of the set. Not good. You don't want that going on. Similar with squats, like if you really try to accelerate all the way through the concentric with straight weight, as you would if you were jumping, guess what's going to happen? You're going to jump. And like jump squats exist, but if your heels leave the ground or the bar comes up off your shoulders a little bit with like 70% of 1RM, especially if you're not ready for it, that could be a little bit hazardous. One of the benefits of bands and chains is just since the weight's getting heavier and heavier as you proceed through the concentric, you can just actively accelerate through a larger portion of the concentric before you have to decelerate there at lockout. So that's good. And also, I mean, especially with bands, I don't know exactly why it feels different than chains, but like it does. Like when bands hit you, they hit you hard. And like on squat, they try to slingshot you through the floor. So I think like a low key benefit of power training with bands is just like they sort of force you to be really, really aggressive with every rep, because if you don't generate velocity out of the hole, like when they hit you, you're going to feel it. But yeah, for any power training, whether you're training with bands or chains or just straight weight, intent matters. Like you really want to try to accelerate the bar as aggressively as possible through as much of the range of motion as possible. But like I mentioned, bands and chains do help you facilitate doing that just based on how they change the resistance curve.
Yeah, this is not directly related to vertical jump and, power and things like that. But I will say COVID-related gym shutdowns completely changed my relationship with bands. For the longest time, I was like, oh, those things are kind of a pain in the ass to set up and all this stuff. And then COVID hit, and man, without bands, I don't know how I would have gotten through that as a person who lifts and as a coach.
Yeah.
Like, man, bands really came through when I needed them, and I will forever be appreciative. So yeah, chains and bands are always going to be on the good side for me. Chains because they're very cool and badass, and bands because when you're in a pinch, especially if you're training at home, they really do expand what you can do.
Oh, for sure. One other thing I'll note, not related to improving explosiveness, gem performance, whatever, but just kind of like a low-key benefit, especially of training with chains, and especially for folks who've been lifting for kind of a long time and are like maybe sort of beat up. So like I mentioned with the Andersen study, for strength development, for power development, you don't want to like fully invert that resistance curve where now instead of being hard at the bottom, easy at the top, it becomes easy at the bottom, hard at the top. Like that's probably not the best way to set them up purely for improving performance. But if you maybe have achy hips or achy shoulders, and you get some like range of motion related discomfort on like bench press, where, you know, if you have pretty heavy weight on the bar, your shoulders or elbows just really don't like you much, specifically at the bottom of the press. But you also don't want to just take 70% of the weight off the bar and just train light all the time. Like, that's not fun. You don't want to do it. Something you can do, which like I've done, and I know a lot of older lifters do this, is you can just put a shitload of chains on the bar. So now like the bench is easy at the bottom where maybe your shoulders aren't quite as happy with you, but it just like gets hard and heavy as you press it. So you can still feel heavy weight in your hands. You can still like really exert yourself, not have to do like 40 reps per set with a super low load, but still, you know, give some of those soft tissues that aren't super happy with you a little bit of a break from the really heavy loading. That's another just like very nice thing you can unlock with accommodating resistance.